Hello, I'm Peter Van Dusen, and this is a CPAC special presentation. We're calling it the G7 Big Five. The leaders of 7 of the world's advanced economies will meet in Canada next weekend for the annual G7 summit. And what was supposed to be a chance to showcase Canada's leadership on the world stage could turn into a very rocky affair. The picturesque Manoir Richelieu in the Charlevoix region of Quebec will play host to the leaders from Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The European Union will also be represented at the summit. And of course, at all of these big gatherings, there are concerns about protests, so security measures are being put in place as well. And just like the mountainous terrain at the summit venue, there may be some steep hills to climb on the path to consensus for the leaders. Everyone is wondering what to expect from U.S. President Donald Trump, who will be making his first visit to Canada right after slapping steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. As the host country this year, Canada determines the agenda, but it can't determine the outcome. And a lot of people are wondering whether that will be decided by the president, who may end up as a chorus of one during most summit discussions. Here's what we do know. When the leaders gather, they will be tackling 5 main themes: investing in growth that works for everyone, preparing for jobs of the future, advancing gender equality and women's empowerment, working together on climate change, oceans and clean energy, and building a more peaceful and secure world. Well, for the past 2 weeks, we've been speaking with cabinet ministers and experts in all of those fields to help us understand expectations and possible outcomes for the summit and what Canada wants to accomplish in each of the categories. And over the next 2 hours, you'll learn what we've learned. And we'll begin with the economy and investing in growth that works for everyone. It's a major theme of the summit. It was meant to focus the G7 leaders on building the middle class, reducing the inequalities of globalization, and empowering women and girls. But the economic discussions may now be focused on how to manage an all-out trade war after the United States slapped steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and Europe. Here's CPAC's Martin Stringer to set the scene for our conversation.
The G7 leaders are supposed to discuss economic growth and gender equality at this summit, but could a trade war triggered by Donald Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum derail the whole agenda?
These tariffs are totally unacceptable. We have to believe that at some point, common sense will prevail.
In the absence of common sense, Canada and Europe are retaliating against the Americans. Justin Trudeau still hopes to lead discussions at this G7 on progressive trade deals such as CETA, the European trade deal, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Canada signed this year. But a message about the value of multilateralism may fall on deaf ears for a president who favors America first.
We are going to continue to highlight that working together as friends and allies is extremely important for the prosperity of each of our citizens.
If they get past the trade dispute, G7 leaders will talk about the $5 to $7 trillion that the UN says is needed to tackle poverty, inequality, and infant mortality. And that's a far cry from the $147 billion in annual contributions that are being made today.
Growth that works for everyone. Well, that's one of the key themes that the G7 leaders will be spending their time discussing, ways to build economic growth that works for everyone. But hanging over the discussions, of course, will be the U.S. president's decision to slap steel and aluminum tariffs on his allies and his efforts to rewrite the rules on trade deals. All in all, it sets up a challenge for Canada at the summit and could crowd out the wider discussions on economic transformation. Let's bring in 3 guests to discuss the growth agenda and what to watch for at the summit. From Toronto today, we're joined by Dion Poehler, Assistant Professor at the Centre for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the University of Toronto. She's a specialist in gender and the economy. And here in Ottawa, I'm joined by Scotty Greenwood, an expert in Canada-U.S. relations. She's the CEO of the Canadian-American Business Council and a former U.S. diplomat here in Ottawa. She usually joins us from Washington, but we have her in the city of Ottawa today, so great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
And Angela McEwen is the Senior Economist at the Canadian Labour Congress. Good to see you as well. Thank you all for joining me to have this discussion. So we'll get in a moment to the conversation about the economic agenda and creating growth that works for everyone. But Scotty, let me start with you. How does this cloud of trade wars and Donald Trump the disruptor hang over not just this conversation at the summit, but all of them?
Well, it really is disruptive, Peter. It's unfortunate. The president and the administration have chosen to use old statutes related to national security to try to get a trade advantage, which is not only inappropriate, it doesn't make sense, but it also runs the risk of harming the U.S. economy. I think for the G7, it's no longer going to be the G7. I think it's going to be the G6+1, because I don't think there will be a consensus. Remember, it used to be the G8, and we know what happened to the 8th partner. So I think it's a real challenge here, and the president likes to do things differently, but unfortunately he's doing things differently, we fear, in a way that's counterproductive, not just for our trading partners around the world, but for the United States itself and for our own self-interest, and that is really unfortunate.
And Angela, what do you think this means for the summit? I think a lot of people looked at the agenda and said, okay, they're getting to some real stuff here if they can find consensus on making some changes. And maybe you don't agree with all of that, but what does this change?
Well, I don't think it changes that much, because I think we've known who Trump was since he's been elected, and we've known that there would be difficult conversations at this summit. We've tried to talk to him about gender equality, and he's willing to talk maybe about women in business, but only very, very narrowly, right? And he wants to talk about progressive trade, but he's not really wanting to talk about how to actually make it work for workers, right? He doesn't talk about changes that benefit the broad majority. He kind of just wants to smash everything and use that as a way to get his own way and further his own personal interests, which is actually, I agree, contrary to American interests. So I think this brings that original conflict into sharper focus, but it was always going to be the G6+1. And I think it just makes the need for these conversations more intense.
Dion, let me get your thoughts on this. Does it turn the agenda upside down now?
Well, I mean, I'm of the opinion that we should just ignore everything he's doing altogether, because I think that it really undermines what should be the primary focus of the summit, which is on the deep structural problems around increasing inequality, the changing nature of work, and persistent poverty around the world.
Okay, let's go there. I mean, Scotty, for a long time, you're plugged into the diplomatic side, you're plugged into the business side. You look at these agenda items, and this is Canada's agenda. Canada wants to talk to the rest of the G7 leaders and come out with a plan that talks about, how to make trade fairer for everyone, how to raise up women in economies around the world. How much progress do you think they can make on that?
Well, having the conversation is certainly important, and Canada's leadership in defining the agenda is meaningful. So I don't think we should discount that just because you've got this recalcitrant disruptor from south of the border. I think the conversation's meaningful. But I think we're going to have kind of a new vocabulary at the G7, actually, or at least it's new to me, maybe not to colleagues on the panel. But when you talk about gender, I think we're going to learn what intersectionality means, which is a concept about discrimination is not just about gender often. It comes from lots of different places, class, place in society, and these are very important conversations to have, and Canada is showing a leadership role in at least convening the discussion.
All right, Dion, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, in terms of the agenda, do you like what you see in terms of what Canada was hoping to do at the summit? Not sure how much success it'll have at getting some kind of consensus, but do you like what you see in terms of the direction?
I do. The only thing I would want to highlight is that I think they're touching on all of the right issues, but I think it's important that they start to think about how these, and maybe it's related to intersectionality, but it goes much beyond all of the different kinds of groups like class and gender and race and all of these things, to actually think about how the different problems are interconnected. So for instance, we can't talk about inclusive growth for all or the changing nature of work and focus on the labor market without understanding that by focusing on traditional forms of business and innovation and the traditional labor market in these ways, that we're really ignoring that a lot of people are actually excluded from the traditional labor market, and that's where a lot of inequality comes from. And so I think it's important that in this conversation that the leaders really think about how all of these different problems are interlinked, especially with the focus now on thinking these things through from different angles.
Angela, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, they did make an effort to mainstream gender equality in the other 4 topic areas.
It's the overarching.
Exactly. So they are starting to think about, if we're building a future economy, what's that going to look like? But I haven't seen the actions that are going to come out of that, right? How are you going to do that? They're starting to have the conversation, which I think is really important. And maybe that's the thing that comes out of this, is to have that new vocabulary to set the tone for future conversation.
Go ahead, Scott.
Well, and it's also about what are the resources that the governments are prepared to bring about. Often when you get world leaders together at something like a G7, there is a commitment that comes out of it of new resources to tackle big global problems, because after all, it is the leadership of these countries that's needed to put real money and real effort. It's not just the job of civil society, it's also the job of modern economies.
And it brings us back again to the Trump conversation. I mean, if they talk about that around the table, is he the guy putting the damper on that, saying, you know, I'm more interested in dealing with what I have at home than I am on trying to, because this conversation at the summit is supposed to also be about how to raise up developing countries and so on with new economic, any deals we talk about, any progress we talk about has to include them as well. And is Donald Trump going to be standing there saying, all fine and good, you guys worry about that, I'm over here trying to do what's right for the American worker?
I mean, I think Trump's a giant warning sign for the other leaders of what could happen if they don't take concrete action, right? We've seen him actually identify a real problem that the economic policies we've had over the past 30 or 40 years of just signing free trade agreements and not making sure that the benefits are shared, of just lowering taxes and not making sure that we, have social programs that lower those barriers for other groups of people, how they're affected differently, this intersectionality. So women need childcare in order to go into the labor force. People with disabilities need accommodation, and employers need to know what that means and how to do that, right? Yeah. So we need these concrete things so that we don't all go down the Trump road.
Dion, let me hear you on that.
Well, I think one of the things, definitely inequality across countries is much larger than we would see within developed countries like Canada and the United States. But I think that we can take some lessons from things that we've learned about inequality in Canada through some of the research that's been done, for instance, out in Western Canada, around thinking through different ways and different models, rather than always going back to sort of the idea that government can solve all the problems with top-down programs. Because I think that in many cases, as we've seen even in our own countries, like in Canada out west, that some of those programs and policies have not actually benefited many people. And so I think we can take some of the lessons that we've learned in our own countries and maybe try and think about trying to address going to those communities and in other countries as well to figure out what their needs are, what kinds of things they would like to see. I think the conversation at the policy level and with politicians around the world is important, but ultimately it doesn't always translate into the kinds of problem solving and kinds of things we need to see on the ground. Let's
finish on this if I can. One of the things that Canada is going to be pushing at this summit is this notion of leveraging private investment in developing countries. That, a lot of aid comes from governments around the world and so on, and some of this has been tried in the U.S. and in Britain. And I guess for a lot of people the question is, okay, how could they make that work? And Scotty, let me start with you, because private companies go where there's profit to be made. And how do you convince them that it's a good idea to invest in developing countries in some of these signature programs? Specifically, Canada wants to raise up women and girls. Where's the money in that for them? Well,
investing in women and girls is a terrific idea, and the private sector understands that from many areas. But a perfect example to your question, Peter, is when you look at sustainability, which is another one of the areas. And where does the money come from? Well, one of the things we'll see at the G7, I think, is an Oceans Plastics Pact. Right. And if you look at the Coca-Cola company, to take one private sector example, they have a pledge to be packaging neutral by, I think, 2025 or something, and they don't have enough, there's not enough plastic, that infrastructure collecting the plastic, the pollution, to allow them to get to that goal. So they're creating a market just by that one company, that one pledge, to help get to that goal. So it's going to take investment and infrastructure on the sustainability side, and it's going to take a recognition on the women and girls empowerment that you can't leave behind, as Hillary Clinton said, 51% of the population, and hope to do well. Business understands that and is absolutely at the table for these conversations.
Right. Dion, let me come to you, and then Angela on that. Private companies investing in women and girls in developing countries, how do you make it happen?
Well, I think we need private companies to be involved in all of the solutions that we might want to try and implement. But I actually think we want to think more deeply about alternative models to economic development, alternative business models, models that haven't been getting as much attention or as much support from government, and even at many levels of government have been facing barriers to the development of organizations that actually might be more useful to empowering women and girls and just everybody who's in local contexts in their local communities. Models that actually are more able to solve some of the local challenges that people are facing. And I think thinking more broadly about different kinds of models is an important first step.
Well, one quick example would be if you look at what MasterCard is doing in Africa, for example, you know, in order to get aid and in order to do many of the things we do in modern society, you need identity. You need proof of who you are, and people don't carry those papers around. So MasterCard has had a very innovative program where they have given people the means of electronic identity validation, so that it's kind of like they skipped over landline phones in Africa years ago and went straight, you know, from nothing to cell phones. That's what's happening through the leadership of companies like MasterCard, who are saying, okay, we're going to help you with your electronic identity. We're going to deliver aid directly to you. It cuts out a lot of the opportunity for graft and corruption, and it gives people a source of identity. So there are really innovative solutions. I could go on and on. Johnson & Johnson's doing mental health. Yeah. So lots of
I think local ownership is really important as well.
That's
so
true.
Things like cooperatives, or in India, there's a self-employed women's association where they've banded together and they have their own bank, and they loan each other money and support each other in creating their own partnerships. But I think one thing we really need to commit to here is corporate accountability, especially in supply chains, because I don't think the answer is going to be from MasterCard's solutions. I think we have to make sure that you can compete on a level playing field by paying your workers fairly in the third world. If you can't, if there's always going to be another corporation that will come in and underbid you, this race to the bottom, then that creates a situation that's very difficult to have development in. What we need is a race to the top. We need a virtuous circle.
Thank you. Quickly, John, to you.
Well, and that's one reason I would push and return to the co-op model as one option, where the owners are of the organization or the business are also the users of the primary users of the services, and that causes some scalability challenges that maybe private businesses could work in partnership with some of these organizations. But I really think we have to think about different kinds of ownership and governance structures altogether.
All right, thank you all. Lots to consider in our conversation today. Good to have you all here, and we'll see what happens at the summit. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you.
In 1980, G7 countries represented 61% of the world's gross domestic product. Today, the G7 countries only make up 46% of the world's GDP. That decreases because of the strong growth in emerging market economies like China, India, and Brazil. Here's how the GDP per capita figures break down for the G7 countries. US, 62.15 thousand. Germany, 50.84 thousand. Canada, 48.47 thousand. France, 44.93 thousand. UK, 44.18 thousand. Japan, 40.85 thousand. Italy, 35.91 thousand. Here's what that looks like for some of the fastest growing economies. Russia, 11.95 thousand. Brazil, 10.22 thousand. China, 10.09 thousand. India, 2.13 thousand.
Notwithstanding some of the economic sore points that will dominate the summit, the Canadian hosts will want the discussion to turn to Canada's priorities: growth and gender equality, trade deals that work for everyone, and international development. I spoke recently with Canada's Minister of International Development about Canada's summit priorities. Minister Bibeau, first of all, thanks for coming in to speak with me.
It's my pleasure.
It's good to see you again. Investing in growth that works for everyone, it's one of the key themes, as we know, of the G7 summit. What specific ideas, what specific proposals will Canada be putting before the G7 leaders?
Well, as you know, I'm very interested in the international development, and the thing is really to bring women and girls around the table, and especially adolescent girls. So for our G7, we will listen directly from adolescent girls from Canada, from an Indigenous, representing one of the Indigenous community, and adolescent girls coming from developing countries. So this is also something that we want to bring to the leaders, the importance of taking into consideration the fact that when we talk about education, for example, we really have to think about the full life cycle of a girl, of an adolescent, because the thing is, if we want to have growth that benefits to everyone, if we want to have empowered women, then we have to take into consideration the whole life cycle of her life, of her, from being a girl, adolescent, and then a woman.
And we also know that, I mean, G7 leaders are going to be dealing with, as they have before, the whole idea of trade, and trade that works for everyone. We know the kind of pushback we've seen around the world from people who don't feel that the trade deals have treated everybody fairly, and that's an important context too, isn't it? In terms of who gets treated unfairly is often women and girls in these trade deals.
Absolutely. And so we want to support, and this is, we want to support women entrepreneurs, and it will be one of the subject of discussion when we, the Minister of Development, will meet with the Minister of Finance. This will be one of our main topic. How can we make sure that our contribution through bilateral programs, but as well through multilateral and international financing institution, that women get their a fair share of this financing, that they have the tools to access this financing as well. So talking about training, but also, really having access to financing and to the chain, the value chain.
Not all countries share Canada's view on this in terms of attaching issues such as gender inequality to things like trade deals and multilateral funding to different organizations and different causes and different programs. Do you think we'll see some of that at the summit, that there will be some resistance to an agenda that says we have to lift up women and girls in order to have growth that works for everyone?
I mean, this decision is really based on evidence. I've been through a very important consultation. I've been traveling a lot. Yes, it came as obvious from these conversations, but it's also based on evidence. And if it has been demonstrated, and there's a study showing that if each country would reach the level of gender equality of the best one in its region, then it would mean $12 trillion additional to the global GDP by 2025. It's huge what women can contribute if they have access to financing, access to the value chain, and really participate fully in the economy of their respective countries and regions.
G7 countries account for about 75% of the world's development and development aid, and 81% of the humanitarian aid, and yet underfunding continues to be a problem. There doesn't seem to be enough money. So I know Canada is really pushing the idea of finding ways to leverage the private sector and philanthropic groups and so on to try and boost the amount of aid that goes to these developing countries. What's the plan?
What's the plan? Well, ODA, Official Development Assistance, so the money coming from government donors, represent more or less $142 billion. If we want to achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, by 2030, we would have to invest, depending on the study, we're talking about trillions of dollars every year. So we definitely have to maintain our official development assistance, but find new friends to invest. So the private sector is obviously one. In terms of investing in business, growing the economy, creating jobs, yes. Last Friday, actually, we made a call to action to the private sector, but more on the philanthropy side, because I have had many requests from philanthropists wanted to to join the Canadian leadership in this area in supporting or defending women's rights. So we are willing to put up to $300 million to bring to be leveraged, I would say, by the philanthropists. So there are different ways to find new contributors if we want to end poverty, and we as Canada, we want to bring new financing partners to support women empowerment in different ways.
What's the message to the private sector, though? I mean, private companies invest where there's money to be made, where there's profit to be made. So what's the incentive for them to invest in a developing country in programs such as the ones that you're talking about to help encourage better opportunities for women and girls?
We have different channels, obviously. So it could be really doing business and making sure that the impact on the development around in the communities where the business is being done will be done in a way that it take into consideration the needs of the women and the community around. It could be really investing in businesses owned by women. So there are different, and it could be also through the philanthropy, really supporting local women's organizations who are really defending their rights. So there are different channels. When we think about the pension funds, for example, they are making investment and thinking in long term. So they might be a very significant partner in that. So we are at the stage, we are having discussion with such type of financing institution to see how they would be interested in investing in funds, social bonds or gender bonds. So there are so many discussions, but while we are getting there, we have to support women to provide training so they can have finance capabilities in terms of financing. So we are really at the stage of getting women ready also to get to benefit from different type of financing.
Right. So is Canada's approach one that you expect will be adopted by the G7 leaders?
Yes, and I mean, we can be all working together for a common objective, because I think all the G7 recognize the importance of women economic empowerment for the benefit of the world, actually. The way we get there, so this is the idea, when we are all sitting together to challenge our views, to learn lessons from others, and to find the ways that will have the greater impact in the field.
But do you expect from the summit to actually come these concrete plans set out by leaders about how they're going to make change, or do you expect it to be the beginning of a conversation that will continue?
It depends on the subject, actually. So, because through the G7 for the International Development Minister, we will be also talking about humanitarian assistance, how we can be more gender transformative. So, yes, I believe that on some of the subjects we will reach an agreement, and we will commit to best practices to really have more impact. This is always what we want. And in other sector, it will be a work in progress.
Let's finish on this. Canada's really, we've talked about it, is pushing an agenda of trade, of economic empowerment, of programs that helps an economy work for everybody, and we've talked about that. It's an agenda of multilateralism. It's an agenda of support for developing countries. But there will be one leader at the summit who kind of does his own thing, and that's Donald Trump. And he may not agree with a lot of the ways that Canada wants to pursue these. He has different objectives. He seems to be closing off America rather than opening it up to multilateralist approaches. Are you concerned that some of the objectives you have for the summit either get stalled or derailed by President Trump?
I think we have the same ultimate objectives on many things. The ways to get there are different in some cases. So the idea of having this honest conversation being among a small group, it's the best way to try to build on the best approach, best practices. And I mean, we all have our values and our priorities, but ultimately we all agree that we want to make the world a better world. We want to be more peaceful, more prosperous. So different ways to get there, but working on the same ultimate objective.
All right. Claude Bibeau, thanks so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Merci.
I'm Peter Van Dusen. This is our CPAC special presentation, the G7 Big Five, our in-depth look at the 5 themes for the upcoming summit of G7 leaders in Quebec. We'll turn our attention now to another summit topic, this one, climate change, oceans, and clean energy. In a moment, I'll speak with the Minister of the Environment, Catherine McKenna. But first, let's set the scene for our conversation with CPAC's Andrew Thompson.
Most G7 countries are of one mind on climate change and the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to under 2 degrees. Of course, there's one big exception.
That's not going to happen while I'm president, I'm sorry.
The United States has left the Paris Agreement. Canada and the other G7 countries remain committed to its binding targets, but all are struggling to reduce their carbon emissions. And the UN has warned that the gap between the reductions needed and the national pledges made in Paris is alarmingly high.
Our problem is that we don't see this as a priority because we don't understand how climate change interacts with and affects everything that's already at the top of our priority lists.
One of Canada's big priorities as G7 host, the world's oceans, and the danger of rising sea levels, melting ice, and extreme weather.
When we look at all the extra heat being trapped inside the climate system by our emissions, 93% of that heat is going into the ocean, and over 25% of our carbon is going into the ocean too.
That's not all that's going into the ocean. There's also plastic waste, millions of tons each year. Canada wants a G7 plastics charter to reduce that number, even if most comes from China and Southeast Asia.
10 rivers in the world contribute 90% of all ocean plastics, and none of those rivers are in a G7 country. But we know that there is a need for real leadership on that.
As Canada looks to lead the G7 in Charlevoix, the numbers remain daunting. Ocean plastic could triple by 2025, and global carbon emissions are projected to rise again in 2018.
Transformation is difficult immediately, that's fine. So we have to have a plan, a long-term vision, to see how this low-carbon economy will be deployed over time, and that's the sense of the vision that we hope these leaders to have.
And joining me now is Canada's Minister of the Environment, Catherine McKenna. Good to see you.
Great to be here.
Thanks for coming in to speak with me. As Minister of the Environment, let's start there. What's your principal objective for the G7 summit?
So we're very excited about advancing environmental issues. I mean, that's everything from climate change, but also there's a real focus on plastics. And we know in Canada, but around the world, people are very concerned about the use of single-use plastics, just throwing away plastics, and then the fact that these plastics end up in the oceans. We've seen pictures of fish, you dissect them, or birds, and they're full of plastic. I was in the high Arctic. And I saw you had birds where they had plastics all the way in the high Arctic. So clearly we've got a huge issue there. So we want to do some work on that as well.
Let's talk a bit, so people have a little bit of background. Studies suggesting 6 to 10 million tons of plastic garbage end up in the ocean each year. That's a stunning number when you're framed that way. It's a stunning number.
Another way to look at it is the concern is by 2050 you'll have more plastic than fish in the ocean.
Yeah. So how do you see Canada's role in leading this conversation? I mean, there's talk about a plastic charter, right?
Yeah.
And so how would that work, and what role do you see Canada playing?
So, I mean, the G7 is really an opportunity to bring together, 7 of the largest economies in the world to tackle big issues. So plastic, great example of an issue where you need international leadership. Prime Minister's been very clear this is an issue that he wants to tackle. But the interesting thing about plastics, when you look at it, you really need to take a broad approach. It's everything from how do we recycle in municipalities all the way to there are rivers in developing countries where these plastics are literally getting washed away and ending up in the oceans. And then, of course, how do you get the plastics out of the ocean? So the idea with a plastic charter or a zero plastic waste charter, because that's what we want to talk about, zero plastic waste. Plastics actually has a value. Sure. $120 billion of each year is wasted because we throw away plastics that we could reuse. But the idea is, what are the practical things that we could be doing? So looking at how do you have ideally targets so that you say we want plastics to be recyclable, compostable, biodegradable by a certain period of time. We want to be supporting developing countries so they can manage their waste, so the plastics literally in places like Indonesia don't go right into the ocean. And so it's doing those very practical things and getting every country to agree that we're going to do it. And then you take it from the G7 to the G20 to the world.
So, and I think the number I saw was half of the plastic being dumped into the oceans is coming largely from countries in Asia. So if that's the case, what's the role for Canada? I mean, if we're not dumping plastics as a nation into the ocean as a rule, and it's happening in other countries, why is it our issue?
Well, it's our issue because we rely on the oceans. We have the largest coastline in the whole world. We have 3 oceans, and so it impacts on us. And so, of course, we need to be working with countries. And there's a number of ways, as I said, that we can be doing it. So we can be working with companies like Coca-Cola and Unilever, companies where the plastics, these single-use plastics are used in developing countries. If we can accelerate action, if we can get them to say, okay, they're going to be 100% biodegradable, recyclable, compostable, that is part of the solution. It's good here because Canadians care about that, but it also helps in those countries. But as I said, we need to also be supporting developing countries. They need better waste management systems. I lived in Indonesia, and if you would have when you had a storm, literally all the plastic waste would just go right into the ocean. If you go diving in Indonesia, you will see plastic bags, you will see microplastics in the water. It's disgusting. And so we all want to do better. It's a bit like climate change. We're all in this together. Oceans don't know any borders, so we need to be working together.
So, you need, do we have a plastics plan in this country? And I don't think we do. We don't have a plan for this country. And so I guess when you get world leaders around a table, because some of the other countries in the G7 do. So if we don't have one, does it make it a more difficult challenge to lead on this if you're not a country that already has a plastics plan?
Well, so we are developing a national strategy around the circular economy. So how do we do better? How do you take a piece of plastic that you use, a plastic water bottle, and make sure that it goes back and you're actually reusing that plastics at the end of the life cycle? So we're working with municipalities and provinces on this. So it's actually good because it helps when you deliver something internationally. It'll be high-level targets that we will have to meet here, and we're working with provinces and municipalities. It's harder. We're a federation, so the federal government, can take some action, but we need to be
jurisdictional issues around.
We need to be working together. We actually do not bad on recycling, but even in a country like Canada, where we're not bad on recycling, we're like around 10%, 10 to 12% of plastics are recycled. That's not great. So there's a lot more we can do, but it's for every country. In the G7 context, you're not going to go to each country and try to figure out how do they manage each little piece. You need high-level goals, and you need a strategy internationally, and then everyone's got to figure out, okay, how do we do it in our own country? But I'm excited because, of course, it will drive action here in Canada as well.
But you're not saying you don't expect to have a plan before the summit.
No, we won't have a plan, but the plan, as I say, it's an international plan. It's overall targets. It's an overall strategy, and then each country has to implement. And we are working with provinces and territories, also municipalities here.
Let's talk about climate change. In April, Canada and France signed a new partnership to step up efforts to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement on climate change. The new deal includes pushing for an international price on carbon and a reduction in transport-related emissions. What do you hope to achieve at the summit on climate change?
So 195 countries came together to say we need to take action on climate change, and now you're seeing businesses and states and cities all taking action and joining in. So we've said it's a top priority. It's clearly a top priority for the Prime Minister. Let's be frank. The U.S. has taken a different approach, so that will be a challenge. And I think in that case, we've said we're all moving forward, and all the other countries, so 6 out of the 7 are absolutely all in on climate action. And as I said, even in the U.S. context, you have cities, you have states, you have businesses.
We're going ahead on their own even.
We're going ahead on their own. So, those are the conversations you need to have. And the good news about the G7, and what I think is important, is that it's not just a pre-cooked communique, that you actually have frank conversations. It's an opportunity to say, hopefully to the president, look, there's a huge economic opportunity of clean growth. And in the United States, you have amazing companies that are coming up with these great solutions. And you might even meet your target.
But he knows that. He certainly heard those arguments. Can Donald Trump be convinced? Is that part of the strategy at a G7 summit, is to try and get Donald Trump
I mean, I think, look,
back on side on Paris and on climate change?
I don't know that I think there's many issues, but I don't think that you're going to see the leaders shy away from talking about climate action, because we need to do that. And in Canada, the Prime Minister is extremely committed. There are other pieces on the environment front. So as I said, like there's the plastics, the Zero Plastics Waste Charter, and there are broader issues that we're talking about, about the middle class, growing the middle class. Gender is a big issue. So climate change will be one of the issues. We're also hosting a G7 environment ministers of fisheries and oceans, and energy ministers. So that is going to be in the fall. That's another opportunity to talk about climate change, and I'm excited about pushing the envelope there as well.
How does it hamper the conversation internationally when you have a president of the United States that's not buying what you're selling, basically? And I don't mean you personally, but isn't buying the need to take the kind of action on climate change that other countries are taking or promising to take. In fact, he's undoing a lot of the efforts that were launched by President Obama. How does that make the challenge more difficult?
Well, as I say, the G7 is an opportunity to leaders to get together and talk about key issues. They're not always going to agree. They're not going to always agree on approaches, but it's a good opportunity to have that conversation. And look, in the United States, I spend a lot of time with states, a lot of time with businesses, where they are taking action on climate change. So we signed an agreement with states representing 40% of the U.S. economy, 40%. Who are all committed to climate action. They see the economic opportunity, the jobs opportunity. You look at red states, the leading states with renewables are red states, states like Texas. And so you have those opportunities. But look, there's always going to be things that you don't agree on, and you have to manage them. I have great faith in the Prime Minister. He's very skilled at this, and having, frank conversations, but also finding points of convergence.
So it almost sounds like there's a workaround to Donald Trump underway in the States, but doesn't that also suggest that, okay, that if you need Paris and you need targets to make stuff happen, maybe you don't? If he's saying, look, we're out of the Paris Agreement, but it's all still happening anyway in the United States?
Well, I mean, it's interesting in the U.S. context. They actually might meet their target without being committed at the federal level. We don't think that's the right approach, but the U.S. is going to make decisions for itself. But as I say, I mean, there's already all this action going on, and we need to keep on acting on climate change. I mean, we are seeing accelerated impacts of climate change right now, extreme weather events, and I was talking to the mayor of Houston. He's all in on climate action because Houston was really impacted when you saw the hurricane. Like, it was terrible. The same with Miami. Rising water levels are a huge threat to Miami. And so there's opportunities to work together, and we're going to continue doing that. I mean, the G7 is one opportunity to have this conversation, but of course this year we also have COP24, so there's going to be discussions around the Paris Agreement too. And I've really noticed the conversation on climate has really moved from states, like from the countries, to businesses and what businesses are doing to accelerate action. That you have the biggest companies in the world committing to 100% renewables, committing to finding clean technology solutions. You have pension funds, you have big BlackRock, so big financial institutions. So is it harder? Yeah, it's a little bit harder, but I'm optimistic that we don't have a choice, but also the economic opportunity is irresistible.
Canada, let me just go back to one thing. Canada and France in doubling down on Paris and climate targets and talking about the need for an international price on carbon. Will that conversation come up at the G7?
So it may not.
With Donald Trump in the room?
Look, I'm not sure. I mean, these conversations, they'll go in the way, they go. That's a commitment for my G7. There will be, the environment ministers meeting, there will be a clear discussion on this. These are important issues. And we have at least 6 countries that we know are committed. And if you look at where the world's gone, like China put a price on carbon pollution. So they've got the largest carbon market in the whole world. You're seeing other countries, Mexico, Chile, Singapore just put a price on pollution. So there's a lot going on in that front, and it's a smart way of doing it. I know there's a discussion here in Canada.
Yeah, we have a domestic debate in this country about whether it's the right way to go.
It's the most efficient way to do what you want, which is reduce emissions, but let people have choices and have the opportunity of clean solutions. And we have great solutions here in Canada. I've been really amazed by the companies, which are oil and gas companies, that are doing things in a cleaner way. Many of them support putting a price on pollution, to the big clean tech solutions that are the game changers.
All right, Catherine McKenna, good to have you here. Thanks for your perspective.
It's great to be here. I wanted to talk to you about one event that we had. It was called Women Kicking It on Climate. Women climate leaders came to Canada. And it was really extraordinary because in the climate context, you've actually seen women take a leadership role. I saw this in the Paris Agreement context. I was 2 days in my job, went off to the Paris negotiations, and it was really women that were leading it. The head negotiator for the UN was a woman, Christiana Figueres. The lead negotiator for France, their climate ambassador, was a woman, Laurence Tubiana. Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, she's leading the focus on climate justice. How do we make sure that we are thinking about grassroots women? We have many leaders, Inuit leaders, female leaders, from Mary Simon to many other leaders. So we brought together these women, and I think that's a theme that's running through our G7 as well, like women leading change, and also women sometimes being disproportionately impacted, or we're not taking as much advantage of the opportunity of, say, for example, women entrepreneurs. And how do we support women entrepreneurs finding these really game-changing solutions? So.
Yeah, and just thank you for bringing us back to it. It's a theme that's running through the whole G7 summit, as we know, in this country. All right, great. Thank you, Catherine McKenna. Good to talk to you.
Much.
Thank you.
Canada and the G7 countries are signatories to the Paris Agreement on Climate, which came into effect on November 4th, 2016. The agreement aims to prevent the global temperature from rising by 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. One of the ways countries can do that is by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Here's where the countries stand on meeting their goals. Canada, reduce emissions by 30% from 2005 levels by 2030. It will be almost 4% short of its goal. France was to reduce its emissions by 40%. It will be 11% short. Germany will not meet its 2020 climate goals and has no current plan to keep itself on track for its 2030 goals of reducing emissions by 55%. Italy's goal is to reduce its emission by 40% by 2030. It projects only a 24% decrease. Japan needs to reduce its emissions by 25% by 2030 and is projecting a reduction of 22.75%.
Well, it's time now to broaden the conversation on climate change, the oceans, and clean energy, and the G7 summit with my next 3 guests. From Toronto, Bruce Pardy. He's a law professor at Queen's University. He calls the Paris climate deal a fairy tale. And he's in our studio there in Toronto. We'll be getting to him in just a moment. Céline Bach is president of Analytic Advisors and an expert on the impact of climate change on business. And Catherine Abreu is the executive director of the Climate Action Network. It's good to see you all. Thanks for taking the time out of, I know you have busy schedules to weigh in on this conversation about the G7 summit, and in this particular case, climate change. And Catherine, let me start with you if I can. When the G7 leaders sit down, Canada will be looking to step up the action to fight climate change, and we'll be doing that in the context of the news of the last little while here that Canada is now the proud owner of a pipeline. This Prime Minister's bought a pipeline. How does that affect the conversation, do you think, around climate change at the G7 summit table?
Yeah, well, it's been a busy week, that's for sure, and no doubt the Canadian government's decision to purchase a pipeline will have some bearing on the negotiations as we head into next week's summit. I think what we're most significantly going to see is a real increase in the expectation of the global community for Canada to deliver a strong climate outcome within the context of the G7. You know, when this government took office, they came in saying we're back when it comes to climate change and climate action at the Paris climate talks. And the world has been looking for Canada to deliver on that promise. And 2018 is a really big year for mounting climate ambition. And so the political signals coming out of the G7 are going to be really critical to securing the momentum of the Paris Agreement, and Canada will be expected to deliver.
All right, Bruce Pardy, let me go to you. You described the Paris climate deal as a fairy tale. How does the purchase of a pipeline by the Canadian Prime Minister factor into that fairy tale story? If it does, is there a connection?
Well, I think the present government has always been a bit two-faced about climate change. They've insisted upon upon signaling their virtue while doing what they have to maintain the economy, and there have been contradictions in there. You know, Paris is a bandwagon, and the bandwagon isn't going anywhere. The G7 leaders are going to have trouble because the US has now announced it's going to leave. A lot of those countries are not on target to meet their own promises. They have a lot of money to transfer to developing nations, and they haven't said where it's going to come from. So they will probably stick with the plan, but the plan is not doing very well.
All right, Céline Bach, let me bring you in. Paris a bandwagon going nowhere?
Well, I think the private sector would suggest that that's not necessarily the case. There are a significant number of global investors who together, 800 of them, represent $70 trillion worth of investment, and they are engaged in calling for greater ambition from countries to actually get us to the point where we can stay under 2 degrees of warming. They're calling for the alignment of global capital flows with the Paris Agreement, and they're calling for a formal acknowledgement of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Risk Disclosure, which requires greater transparency of issuing companies to investors.
But we in this country, we have auditors general from across the country back in March saying Canada won't meet its Paris targets for 2030. I'm not, and again, in the context of the government purchasing a pipeline and so on. I mean, if we're not, where's Paris actually going if countries like Canada aren't meeting the targets?
Yeah, well, everything seems impossible until it's done. So in part, we are far away from our target because we are just recovering from a decade of inaction at the federal level on climate change. And it takes time to make up for what has been lost. But this government started moving fairly quickly with the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change and Clean Growth, which does offer some very significant policies in every other sector of our economy but the oil and gas sector. There we have some promises around methane, but of course we need to be driving emissions down deeper. The conversations are difficult. We have some tricky ones to have here in Canada when it comes to economic diversification. But if Paris is a bandwagon, it's the most popular bandwagon that the world has ever seen. And from my perspective, when China's talking about phasing out coal, Saudi Arabia is talking about diversifying away from oil, we're definitely heading in the right direction.
All right, Bruce Pardy, let me bring you back in. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Peter. Yes, it is the most popular bandwagon, but that doesn't mean that it's effective. It's not effective, and it doesn't have very much to do with what Canada is doing. What Canada does or does not do is inconsequential to what happens with climate change in the long run. Paris is set up so that the world's largest emitter, China, has promised to do essentially nothing until 2030. And in exchange, the developed countries have agreed to essentially transfer $100 billion a year to developing countries, starting in a couple of years. And the sum total of what Paris does means that it is not really about the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It is really about transferring wealth, about signaling virtue, and about global governance. And you should not expect any real climate change solutions to come from it.
Okay. Response?
Well, I mean, China is in the process of implementing the world's largest GHG emissions control system through an emissions trading system. This is a very serious undertaking that's been underway for more than 5 years now. Every single large emitter in China is now subject to that cap and trade system. It is true that the Paris Agreement includes a commitment to providing development assistance through the climate finance. But it's also true that the vast majority of capital that will flow to address climate change comes from the private sector. And the private sector is acting. The political process is important, the G7 is important, but global investors and global corporations are taking action, and they are making commitments to reduce their GHG emissions by 2025 to zero in some cases. And that includes not just their own operations and the energy they buy, but also that of their supply chain.
Can you let me ask? Can there be any progress made on climate change at the summit if Donald Trump's in the room? I mean, that's what everybody's talking about. Is he going to sort of lay waste to these conversations? And I'll get all of your views on this. What effect does Donald Trump being in the room have on the desire by clearly some at the table to move forward with climate change progress?
I would say there's two tracks that we can expect the G7 leaders to angle their conversations around climate along. One is the track where there is that diplomatic effort made to seek consensus, but remembering that consensus is not necessarily unanimity. And so I think, can expect the G7 leaders to have a conversation where they're able to come to some common ground around reaffirming the Paris Agreement and their various actions on climate change.
Which obviously won't include Donald Trump.
That's exactly right, and that's what we saw last year in Italy during their G7 summit, that the 6 countries that remain committed to the Paris Agreement came together to say this is how we're acting on climate change, and there was a footnote exception of the United States, which at the time was still figuring out their position on the Paris Agreement. But the second track is a really interesting one, where I think that there will open up some avenues for conversations about innovative, intersectional ways of weaving in sustainability. And so we know that one of the main focuses of this year's G7 revolves around oceans. We of course know that protecting the oceans relies on addressing climate change. Building resiliency in coastal communities relies on addressing climate change. But it gives an avenue of talking about these issues and overall sustainability and resilience that isn't just about the Paris Agreement.
Bruce Pardy, what do you think Donald Trump brings to the conversation? What do you think he changes about the conversation?
Trump has been exactly right in what he's done. The Paris deal is a waste of time. If anything, it is an obstacle to actual progress. Now, he probably has his own reasons, but as far as I'm concerned, Paris is a problem, not a solution. If Paris was as good as everybody was saying, then you wouldn't need all these countries to keep talking. They already have a deal. I mean, Paris is a deal. If it works, well, then let it play out. But that's not what's happening. The countries are still sort of talking about what to do and how to do it, and I thought that was all resolved, but no. Paris is just the beginning of an endless conversation. And as far as I'm concerned, there is
Does it have to be that way? Does it have to, I mean, you're right, they're just at the Bonn conference, and they can't seem to get their head around how the rules are to proceed. I think that's what you're talking about.
That's right. And one of the matters of contention in Bonn was, when are we going to know where the money is coming from? The developing countries asked, and the developed countries, now that there are no Americans to help foot the bill, didn't give an answer. So I suspect that in that respect and others, although publicly these leaders will continue to endorse the agreement, I think there are some cracks, and I hope those cracks will lead to its eventual end.
Does Mr. Pardy have a point in suggesting that there needs to be some movement on some of these key issues? I mean, where's the money coming from? When's it going to come up? When are they going to finally reach a deal on how to apply this treaty that comes into effect in 2 years? Celine?
Well, I think there's a lot to be considered in terms of how finance is counted and what's considered to be part of the $100 billion a year commitment. The private sector.
Will they get to any of that at this summit? I mean, is that the place where we're supposed to be at now, like getting these sort of hard answers?
I'm not sure that this particular summit is the place for where those hard answers are going to be obtained. But certainly commitments to the global climate facility as the Green Climate Fund, as an example, is an area where G7 leaders can show some leadership. The private sector, investments in the low carbon economy are so significant and so far greater than the $100 billion discussion that I think we need to enlarge the conversation a little bit that, yes, the political process is important, but global capital markets are what are going to make this happen. And global investors have decided that the risks to their investments are too great to ignore this.
Catherine?
I mean, not only are we seeing investments in the solutions, but we're seeing divestments from the problem. So the World Bank at the Paris Summit in December 2017 said that it would stop investing in oil and gas and coal projects by 2020. And so we're seeing, as Celine has said, the private sector move in that direction. When it comes to international agreements like the Paris Agreement, I mean, you can't expect that agreement alone to do the work. The work happens on the ground domestically in the countries that have agreed to it. And so you can't simply say, oh, at an international scale, 197 countries are coming together and having a difficult conversation and therefore the Paris Agreement isn't working. No, where the work happens is at the ground level. We would not have the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change and Clean Growth were it not for the Paris Agreement. It doesn't mean that the job is done, but it does mean that we are being compelled to act. And I think the evidence is very clear around the world, both at the political level and also in the private sector, that signal has been sent and the world is acting.
All right, a quick comment to you, Bruce Party, and I think that'll be our time, but go ahead.
Yes, well, if private investments were actually being made as described, then that would be great, because that means that they would be doing that because that would be the best way to make a return on their investment. But a lot of the investments that are being referred to are actually public bodies or related to public bodies with public money, very large pension funds, and they are responding to subsidies and other signals that governments are producing. So this is not the private marketplace responding naturally. And if it was indeed simply a matter of the private marketplace providing investments, well, that would be great, but that would mean that it would have nothing to do with the Paris deal. So either way, the Paris deal doesn't work.
Is that true? I mean, Celine Bach, you deal with these companies all the time. Are they just taking advantage of government subsidies, or are they shelling out their own money on this?
No, what markets are efficient, and where we have prices on pollution and rising and reliable prices on carbon and other environmental pollutants, investments flow. And we know that because we've had agreements, international agreements on acid rain in the past, and they have led to profitable business and significant investments by the private sector that have actually delivered results.
Okay, that's our time for our conversation. Thanks to all three of you. We'll see how the leaders do on this issue. It may not be the only difficult one around the table by the time they get done talking, but we'll see where it takes us. Thanks to all of you. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks for having us.
Hello again, I'm Peter Van Dusen. You're watching our CPAC special presentation, the G7 Big Five. We are taking an in-depth look at the 5 themes chosen by Canada for the summit next weekend in Quebec. Now, the overarching theme for the summit is advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. Coming up, I'll ask Canada's Minister of Employment what this country is after at the summit and what challenges we face in the fight for gender equality. But first, let's hear from CPAC's Elizabeth Zogales and the focus on women and girls.
A focus on women and girls will dominate this summit's agenda.
Canada has decided to incorporate gender equality as a key theme across the entirety of the G7 this year.
At last year's summit in Sicily, the G7 leaders endorsed a set of principles on gender equality, including increasing women's leadership, strengthening access to quality jobs, and eliminating violence against women and girls. Prime Minister Trudeau will highlight Canada's commitments to gender equality, like this year's federal budget, which was submitted to a gender-based analysis and promised funding for women entrepreneurs, and Canada's Feminist International Assistance Plan. But at least one international aid campaign is calling on Trudeau to do more. Bono's One campaign wants Canada to get the G7 nations to commit more for women's empowerment.
But we will not
In the lead up to the summit, Canada announced $300 million to leverage private donations to women's organizations around the world, as well as a focus on women's access to education.
I'm proud that one of the primary initiatives we hope to achieve at this year's G7 is a meaningful commitment to and investment in girls' education, especially in crisis and conflict-affected states.
But aid groups say that's still a far cry from the billions that will be necessary to make a difference worldwide. And many activists are also asking for greater accountability from G7 countries once they've made their commitments and gone home.
Well, let's dig a little deeper on the G7 theme, the overarching theme of gender equality and women's empowerment at the G7 summit. Patty Hajdu is Canada's Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour, and she is with me now. It's good to see you again.
Morning.
Thanks for coming in to speak with me. I think there's growing concern now around the summit based on the actions from President Trump. A lot of people think he's now triggered a trade war, and concern that Canada's put a lot of effort into this particular theme at the overarching theme of gender equality and women's empowerment, and some concern that this and other issues will get sidelined by the fight over trade and tariffs and so on. How worried are you about that?
Well, I think, our commitment to gender equality is, of course, not just because it's the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And this is actually interwoven into an economic agenda, and it has been since we took office. As a former Minister of Status of Women, it became very quickly apparent in that file that if you're not talking about the economic empowerment of women, really everything else falls to the sidelines. And so my expectation is that the Prime Minister will continue to push an agenda that ensures that women have every opportunity to economically succeed and really help drive the conversation towards the fact that this is good for economies. And that's exactly what I expect that he'll do.
There's some big differences here around the table in terms of, I think a lot of people are aligned, but one person in the room won't be in terms of multilateralism. Some of the U.S. policies on foreign aid, Donald Trump has rolled back, policies about funding for reproductive rights. U.S. aid money goes to agencies. They're not allowed to talk about abortion. They're not allowed to provide abortion or counsel on abortion. How do you think that gets dealt with when there's one person who's got a different view of how aid can work and how women and girls can be lifted up in different parts of the world than others around the table?
Well, I think the point of the G7, from my experience and the way that I've participated in sort of international events and international conversations, is about talking about Canada's policies around reproductive choice and connecting that to why it's so important to the overarching theme of gender equality. And I've often said in many interviews, listen, at the foundation of gender equality is the ability to choose your own path as a woman, and that includes reproduction. When, if, or how you'll reproduce should be fundamentally a woman's choice. And if you don't have that choice, really, it's very difficult to talk about the next steps. If I think about the days gone by where where contraception wasn't available, for example, and women were having multiple babies, sometimes 7 or 10 babies. That's fine if a person chooses to do that and wants to do that. But if you don't have a choice, then how can you talk about empowering women to, seek better employment or education or escape a life of poverty in some cases? And so that's why our foreign policy around foreign aid is so connected to empowering women and girls, because we know that that is actually what changes communities, when women do have control over their own bodies and control over their own lives.
I was going to ask that, what are you up against at the table in these kinds of discussions? And it's been that way for decades, but perhaps there's a sense that there's some sort of change. And how do you change the channel from programs and foreign aid and contributions from countries that in many ways treat women and girls as the beneficiaries and recipients of aid as opposed to the people who will actually make change in the world?
Well, I think one of the things that we've done, and I actually should say the Prime Minister has done, is he's firmly put the success of women at the center of what he does. From the very first historic 50% women at the cabinet table and women holding senior positions and very important positions within the government in terms of officers of parliament, etc., the approach that we've taken to all our public appointments, I think that's one of the first things is you model the behavior and you demonstrate why it's successful. If you can connect it to successful governance, if you can connect it to successful economies, I think those are the kinds of compelling arguments. I was a social justice activist for years and years and years, working in the area of homelessness and drug policy, and I can tell you that the social justice argument only goes so far. You need to attach evidence and outcomes to those arguments so that you can have a compelling vision for other people that are having power to set policy.
What do you think success is at this summit? Will we see concrete proposals about employment issues, raising women up in countries around the world, or is it about really pushing the conversation further down the road?
Well, I know that we always work towards outcomes where we can, push our colleagues and ourselves to hold ourselves accountable to, better outcomes for all of our citizens. That's the whole point of the G7, really, is to come together and talk about how we accelerate the work that we're doing so that our citizens thrive in better ways, more quickly. And so my hope is that the final communique or statement actually reflects that. Now, having said that, there's always negotiations because people feel differently about different things. But our role in this G7 is to lead, and that's exactly what I know our Prime Minister will do.
All right, lots to talk about, lots to look forward to at the G7 summit. Patty Hajdu, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Peter.
I think the biggest thing they can do is ensure that women have access to education and access to training so that they can have jobs and support their families.
I think they could make a formal commitment to establish gender equality in parliaments and legislatures around the world.
Having the opportunity to see women at the table and participating in that level of debate, I think is a good thing, and setting an example for other countries that may not be as progressive as Canada.
Well, advocacy groups have seized on the key theme of the G7 summit, gender equality and the empowerment of women, and say they won't be happy with more platitudes from G7 leaders. Many women's groups from Canada and around the world were invited to be part of the consultations leading up to the summit and to make recommendations for addressing gender equality, some of the things they would like to see to help build a better world and build a stronger worldwide feminist movement, a stronger role for women in the economy, on climate change, and on matters of peace and security and so on. Two of the women involved in a lot of those consultations leading up to the summit are with me today. Kate Higgins is the Director of Policy and Campaigns for Oxfam Canada. She's with me here in Ottawa. And from Toronto, we're joined by Paulette Senior, the President of the Canadian Women's Foundation. It's good to see you both. Thanks for coming in to talk with me.
Thanks for having us.
Look, let's start with, I guess, the story that keeps developing here before we actually get into the theme of gender equality and women's empowerment. And that's the actions of the U.S. President Donald Trump and the trade fight he's now triggered. Paulette, let me start with you. How concerned are you that the discussions around tariffs and trade and the ongoing fights will maybe crowd out the other important discussions and proposals on gender equality and women's empowerment at the summit?
Well, I did wake up this morning wondering about that and hoping that despite what's happening with the trade talks, that we'll still be able to have a strong focus on what I know was the Prime Minister's intent, is to have a focus on gender equality as President of the G7 this year. So I'm hoping that despite what's happening, that those issues can be discussed robustly, and that our Prime Minister will be able to, at the same time, be able to address the concerns of Canada as it concerns our economic future.
Kate, how concerned are you about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're also very concerned about the implications of this for the summit, but I agree with Paulette on this. I do think that the Prime Minister in Canada has shown a strong commitment to gender equality, having that as a key theme of this G7 and mainstreaming it throughout all of the ministerial discussions has been a really excellent sign. The Prime Minister's appointment of the Gender Equality Advisory Council was a really strong step, and we do hope that that's something that can be institutionalised in the G7 processes going forward. So I do think there is a strong commitment. There's a lot at stake. Gender is really front and centre in this G7 process, and I do think that the Prime Minister and the Canadian government will remain very committed to pushing the G7 leaders to continue to really focus on this important issue.
Well, I want to double track our conversation a little bit. I mean, we have we can look at the focus on domestic issues here and gender equality and women's empowerment domestically. Paulette, we can also look at it the way Canada is trying to lead this conversation about how to change things around the world. And again, with President Trump in the room, he sees foreign aid and how it's applied for issues involving women and girls a lot differently than many of the other leaders around that table. How do you think the Prime Minister, Paulette, should be dealing with that? Donald Trump's view of how foreign aid should be used to raise up women and girls around the world, and how maybe some of the others, including Canada's Prime Minister, see it.
Well, it's time for a different approach to make sure that gender is not seen as a fringe or sidelined issue. And I commend our Prime Minister for making this a central theme and topic of the G7. And I think that most countries around the world, whether in or outside of the G7, actually view Canada as a leader on this issue. And so the fact that he has taken this lead, my hope is that other G7 leaders will also be seeing this as important in their own national and global role to make sure that gender is central to part of what they are discussing and the decisions that they're making, and that furthermore, that those decisions have the critical gender-based analysis and lens that it deserves. I think it's for far too long that that countries around the world have been absent of women's voices at key decision-making tables. And so what we who came together in Ottawa a few weeks ago through the W7, and I think joined by the members of the Gender Equality Advisory Council, what we're all saying together is that this needs to be central to how decisions are made, to discussions around critical tables, and that women's lives are critical to the economic security of the world. And leaving us out of those conversations is only detrimental to an entire country in terms of its economic outlook, but also women's lives are at risk, whether it's because of peace and security discussions, whether it's about climate change. We know that violence against women and girls has been an ongoing issue that hasn't been tackled the way that it deserves to be tackled. And so, if leaders are really serious and committed to making a change in these issues, then it has to be part of the discussions. And furthermore, women must be around these decision-making tables for those discussions and other discussions, because I think I'd go further to say there is nothing that happens in this world, there's no decisions that are made where women's lives are not impacted.
So what should Kate, what do you expect to see if the summit's going to be a success in dealing with these issues? What does it look like? What do you want to hear from it?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and this week we have the development ministers and the finance ministers meeting for their ministerial in Whistler. Winnie Byanyima, who is Oxfam International's executive director, is there as a representative of the Gender Equality Advisory Council, and she's definitely asking the Canadian government and G7 leaders to step up on aid, to take Canada's lead. We have a Feminist International Assistance Policy that was a fantastic announcement of the Canadian government last year, and I do think that there is an opportunity for Prime Minister Trudeau, the Development Minister, the Finance Minister to really push other governments in this direction. I think it's very good news for us that we have France taking on the next presidency next year. President Macron has said that he is absolutely committed to continuing this commitment to gender equality. So I think that that's really important. I think another issue that we really need to think about is the structure of the economy, and that's what the finance ministers are talking about. It's going to be a big issue next week at the G7 Leaders Summit. And so a good outcome for us would be some really good discussions around the structure of the economy and how the economy is really rigged against women. Women dominate precarious jobs. They dominate underpaid work. They carry the huge burden of unpaid and low-paid care globally. So pushing that discussion, having discussions around that, I think will be really a really strong outcome. The G7 process is a process that continues year after year, and so we do want to see some big wins, but we also want to see kind of incremental changes, and the institutionalization of gender equality is a really key issue for the G7.
Well, let me ask you about that. So what does success from this summit look like to you?
Well, I think Kate has really said it. She's hit it on the nail. And I would go further to add that the fact that France is hosting next year gives us hope that this will continue not just in France but beyond. So what we hoped coming out of our W7 gatherings a few weeks ago was that this would be a model that could be carried forward in future G7 meetings, where women are coming together to identify what are the critical issues and what is it about those issues that need to be included in the discussions going forward, and that we can have significant impact in terms of the outcomes of these gatherings. So adding to Kate, I think that's the only thing that I would say is that we want to see that this is an ongoing structure of future G7 meetings.
All right, if that's what success looks like, Paulette, what does failure look like?
Well, as you start out this discussion, to me a failure would be a couple things. One is that the discussions are being dominated by the recent developments in terms of trade and the NAFTA talks. But furthermore is that this is ignored. So we don't want this to be ignored. In fact, 60 plus feminists and activists, women came together from the global north and south and from G7 countries and beyond to say that this is important. And it didn't take us very long to get on the same page in terms of what are the fundamental issues for women's lives that impact women in where they live in communities around the world, and how the work needs to happen. So for me, it's that if this is ignored, it will, it's to the peril of the future of these issues for women. And I think it's about time that we pay significant attention to what we're saying as women who've been doing this work. There are significant dollars, for example, that's going towards international aid. And we want to see that international aid is going towards grassroots women's organizations that are making significant impact and know their communities best. Women know how to solve the problems that they're dealing with in their local communities.
And that's coming. A lot of that funding is coming from the Canadian side, $300 million. So yeah. So let me finish with you then, Kate. What does failure look like? What's failure at this summit if they don't get to these important issues?
Yeah, let me add two things here, building on what Paula just mentioned. I think on the aid side, the foreign aid side, I think no commitment on foreign aid would be a failure. The government is committed to moving forward an agenda around adolescent girls, around education in crises, and I think we're really hoping that the Canadian government is able to mobilize resources in this space. So that will be a success. Failure will be if that doesn't take an approach that really has gender equality at its core and that doesn't really acknowledge the importance of women's rights organizations in delivering foreign aid and tackling gender equality. The other failure will be if we continue having this discussion around just adding women and stir, and therefore we have women's economic empowerment. That's not how it works. We have a global economy that's rigged against women. It's rigged against poor women. So failure for me will be if we're not able to just move the needle a little bit on that conversation and really understand and have a conversation about structural changes needing to happen in the global economic system to make sure the global economy works for women, particularly poor women in this world.
All right, Paulette Senior in Toronto, Kate Higgins here in Ottawa. Thank you both for your time on this. Good conversation and tells us what to watch for when these leaders get together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.
The gender gap is a combination of economic participation and opportunity, education, health and survival, and political empowerment. France ranks 11th overall on the Global Gender Gap Report for 2017, according to the World Economic Forum. Germany is 12th, the UK 15th, Canada 16th, the US 49th, Italy 82nd, and Japan 114th out of 144 countries. Iceland, Norway, and Finland are the top 3 ranked countries, while Syria, Pakistan, and Yemen are at the bottom. Closing the pay gap between the genders would take 170 years, according to the World Economic Forum. But it would increase global annual GDP by 26% if accomplished by 2025.
Eleanor Blomstrom is the co-director of We Do, the Women's Environment and Development Organization, a global women's advocacy organization. She joins me from New York City. Eleanor Blomstrom, good to see you. Thanks for taking time to speak with us today.
Hi, Peter. Thank you very much.
Let me get to your expectations for the G7 summit in just a moment, but let's start with this. How significant is it that the Canadians are making gender equality and women's empowerment the sort of link through all of the themes that the leaders will be dealing with at the summit?
It's extremely significant, Peter. We're in 2018, and it's been 3 years since there was the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, which held gender equality as one of the main 17 SDGs. And we have a number of other international agreements that are really putting gender equality at their core. And that's important because at the same time we're seeing that gender equality is one of the most pervasive inequalities in the world. And we also know that the G7, of course, the leading economies, the advanced countries in the world, have a lot of responsibility and a lot of power to shape those changes.
So how do you think that changes the conversation around the summit table?
It changes the conversation in that it's a constant reminder to think about not only the women who are in leadership positions, but also women in their communities on the ground. And I think it really brings that personal aspect, the understanding of who the citizens are in these countries. And I hope that it's a real reminder to the leaders of who they're actually working to serve.
Okay, let's talk about what you want to see from the G7 leaders and and how they move forward in that notion of they're there to serve people. What kind of concrete action is required from this meeting? What do you want the leaders to do?
I would like the leaders to identify what their concrete action is on climate change. That's one piece. And related to that is the financing for climate change. We know that most countries have put in their NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, for how they're going to tackle climate change. And of all of them that are put in, only 64 mention gender, and none of the G7 countries have yet mentioned gender in their NDCs. And so there's a lot of action that can be taken on that ground. The G7 countries can really identify the action that they'll take on how they're going to implement their climate actions in a gender responsive way, looking at mitigation as well as adaptation.
Can I start? Let me jump in there to ask you, what is the straight line? Because I think a lot of people will be interested in that. What's the straight line between the effects of climate change and the need to take concrete action, and the straight line from that to its impact on women in particular?
Well, I don't know if it's exactly a straight line, but there are definitely lines to underscore why it's important to address women in particular. And I'd like to back up just a little bit and say, when we're talking about gender and climate change, it's often seen as women and climate change, but it's really important to remember that gender is not binary, and it's also a socially constructed idea. And so it's constantly changing, and also it's different in different contexts. But regardless, we know, as I said in the beginning, that gender equality is one of the most pervasive inequalities. So therefore, women have less access to resources, productive resources, financial resources, time resources, and less access to bank accounts and capital. And they're also more responsible for the unpaid domestic and care work. So that's the context that we're sitting in. And then climate change is likely to have any number of impacts. And again, they'll vary throughout the world, but there may be more heat waves, droughts, floods. And in all of those cases, it's often women who are responsible for taking care of family members, whether children or elderly. And so dealing with a crisis situation, they're addressing more than their own needs. And that can be very much a burden and can also impact their own health and security. Additionally, in many cases, women are responsible for ensuring that there's water and fuel supplies in their home. And with climate change, water supplies are either more scarce, or they may not be, the quality may have degraded. And so women are walking further and risking their lives to get the water. Additionally, things like floods in developed countries, when there's a large hurricane and resultant flooding, single mothers, for example, have a harder time getting to work and may need to leave a job in order to ensure that they're able to take care of the rest of their responsibilities. So there are lots of wavy lines and interconnected lines in this issue.
Okay, in the lead up to the summit, my sense has been a lot of the focus, certainly I think from in the kind of conversations we've seen from the Canadian government, and not all of it, but a lot of the focus seems to be on the economic empowerment of women and getting more women into the workforce and into, in many cases, male-dominated fields in education and employment. How comfortable are you with that as the focus, and are you concerned that it leaves some, it maybe isn't as specific as it needs to be with plans for marginalized women in developing countries and so on?
You're exactly right on that. It's not really enough. There has been a lot of focus on building entrepreneurial skills for women, but not every person, certainly not every woman, wants to be an entrepreneur or has that opportunity. And again, the most marginalized don't have access to the education or the resources to then take up those positions in this new economy. If we're looking at a low carbon or no fossil fuel economy, there's a lot of work to be done for capacity building and economic empowerment so that women are able to come into the new positions that are available. This is something that we would call, in thinking about climate change, a just and equitable transition, so that as jobs disappear in the fossil fuel economy, that it's not only those who lost their jobs who are finding jobs in the new renewable energy economy, but there's actually entry points for marginalized women, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, to have capacity building and training and enter into the workforce on all of those types of jobs. But again, there's still women who are living in marginalized circumstances or communities who won't have access to those positions. And so they still need to be recognized for the needs that they have and the contributions they're making to their own development and communities, and to be supported with that. And one way that the G7 countries can think about this is in terms of where they're putting their funding and how that's being directed towards women's groups, feminist groups, and organizations on the ground who are doing this work.
Right. Okay. You were at a women's summit here in Ottawa a few weeks ago, the W7, where G7 leaders, well, they weren't there, but they were being urged at this summit not to overlook the issues of gender-based violence and reproductive health rights for women. How easy do you think it will be to get to any kind of consensus to take more action on those kinds of issues with Donald Trump in the room? And he's already changed U.S. policies to prevent funding or even counseling for abortion. Do you see a big challenge there?
I see a huge challenge there. Going into the G7 summit, it's the leaders are at a disadvantage with this, but at the same time it's known. And I think what we need to see from all of the G7 is their leadership on the issues and standing firm that they do understand the importance of sexual and reproductive health and rights and women's bodily autonomy, and how that will help support many of the other issues that they've lauded as important focus areas for gender equality, whether it's access to economic empowerment and jobs, or leadership positions. And I think that the Canadians, as the leaders of the G7 this year, will have to do a lot of work to figure out what can the outcome be and how can they stand strong on that, because there can be no progress for gender equality if it's not addressing gender-based violence, violence against women, and access to reproductive health services, and definitely to those rights that all women have.
How confident are you, let's finish on that, how confident are you that the things that you have spoken about with me today, and that certainly other women activists have talked about and say are needed, will actually be delivered by the G7 leaders? What will success look like at this summit for you?
Success will look like, one, markers in the communique that they have heard what women are saying. Canada has the Gender Equality Advisory Council, as well as had the W7, the Feminist Forum for inputs, and youth and labor, and there have been a lot of amazing inputs and guidance and ideas to the G7. So success would be seeing the markers of that language there, but success would also be really clear mechanisms. So what will the G7 countries do in their own national space, and also together in foreign policy space to take it forward?
Okay.
And that may look like direct funding commitments to gender equality. It could look like accountability and transparency in terms of their own climate change action and how that's gender responsive.
So if they agree to, let me frame it this way, if instead they agree that there's been lots of good conversation about this, but there's more conversation needed, how will you feel about that? As opposed to, as you talk about, clear markers and benchmarks of where they're going to take the conversation.
That is not success. We've had a lot of rhetoric, and we need to turn the rhetoric into action. And knowing that the G7 come together every year, they have immense influence. They have immense funding behind them. I would also like to see something noted that they could take the military spending allocations, it's 1.7 trillion in 2017, and allocate some percentage of that directly to gender equality funding, directly to sustainable development work and climate change work. That would be a real success.
Lots to watch for. Eleanor Blomstrom, appreciate your perspective today. Thanks for taking time to speak with me.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Hello, I'm Peter Van Dusen. Our CPAC special continues, the G7 Big Five. It's our in-depth look at the upcoming G7 Leaders Summit in Quebec and what will be discussed around the table when the leaders from Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, France, Germany, Italy, and the European Union meet for 2 days. Now, high on the agenda will be the issue of security, or as the Canadian hosts have billed it, building a more peaceful and secure world. And maybe a tall order given the many challenges facing the world these days and some of the recent moves made by U.S. President Donald Trump. In a moment, I'll speak with Canada's Minister of Public Safety, and I'll speak with security and diplomatic experts about what to expect at the summit. But first, let's hear from CPAC's Andrew Thompson, who will set the scene for us.
G7 leaders have no shortage of security problems to confront, but finding consensus may not be easy. And that's mostly because of one man.
As long as I hold this office, I will defend America's interests above all else.
With Donald Trump serving up his allies a wave of uncertainty and anxiety. There's the hot and cold relationship with North Korea, the ongoing discord with Europe over military spending and Russia. And the United States has left the Iran nuclear agreement, instead promising a new wave of economic and military pressure.
We will be working with our allies to find a real, comprehensive, and lasting solution to the Iranian nuclear threat.
But those allies gathered at the G7, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, remain committed to the Iran agreement and opposed to new sanctions. So with Donald Trump in the room at the G7, where's the room for common ground?
On all of these fronts, Trump basically has a very unpredictable and unstable, in some ways, foreign policy. Building the consensus that you would typically need or would expect to even come out of a G7 summit is really no longer there.
Yes, that's right. G7 governments have sought security cooperation in some areas under Canada's leadership. Fighting terrorist recruitment and financing, dealing with foreign terrorist fighters who want to return home, and protecting their countries from election interference and social media disruption.
Certain global actors are deliberately attempting to undermine the strength of our democratic institutions, using whatever means they can.
As for those other big geopolitical questions, from China and North Korea, to Iran and Syria, to Myanmar, Ukraine, and Venezuela.
All of these things you would deal with in an ideal world, but again, right now the challenge is, Trump could very well just tweet something and an entire communique goes out the window.
Well, let's bring in Canada's Minister of Public Safety now, Ralph Goodale, to get his thoughts on how he would like to see G7 leaders deal with some of the world's pressing security and peace challenges. Mr. Goodale, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Let me start with this, just before we get into some of the details of the security issue. Let's talk about what you can't predict, and that's what the U.S. president might say or do at the summit. And so how does Donald Trump and some of the actions we've seen in the last few days, and going back some time on Iran, on trade, on Israel. How does that increase the odds against finding consensus on key security issues at the summit?
Well, the G7 is an extraordinarily useful forum. It has proven that over the years. When you have the 7 leaders all sitting together around the same table, not in a big conference hall, but in a relatively small room with few other people horning in on the conversation, it's a forum that can do some very good work. And obviously in today's environment with a good deal of friction in various places around the world, the leaders are going to have to pay very close attention to getting the results they need to contribute to a prosperous world and to contribute to a safe and secure world.
It sounds like there might be some concerns now that the trade fights and tariff fights might overshadow some of the other important talk at the summit. And I guess let me frame it this way. How concerned are you that you may end up at the end of it with a G6 in effect by the end of the meeting, with an isolated Donald Trump as a party of one on a lot of these issues? And I guess I'm wondering if a trade war with Canada could spill over into matters of common security between Canada and the United States. Or should we be concerned about that?
Well, clearly, the course of discussion over the last number of days has taken some very difficult turns, and that's not going to make the work of the summit any easier. But you have 7 of the world's most important leaders who are dealing with many of the world's most important topics, and I hope and I trust that they will rise to the occasion. Obviously, they have critical economic and trade issues to deal with, but there are also other matters that they need to discuss, like security and safety, and they will work very hard. Certainly, our Prime Minister will work very hard to make sure that this is a productive discussion.
Yeah, let me give you a concrete example. And for instance, we know your government is looking at reopening the Safe Third Country Agreement with a view with the Americans to maybe look at a better way to track the flow of asylum seekers into Canada and so on. Can you still have those kinds of conversations while you're fighting a trade war with the U.S.? Do those things spill over into each other, and is that a problem?
Well, no doubt the various conversations affect other conversations, but the fact of the matter is the Americans have exactly the same challenge on their southern border. And we will engage in a useful discussion with them to try to get them focused on how we can make all 3 of our countries in North America safer and more secure. The fact of the matter is, these are issues that transcend economic disputes. They are issues that go very quickly to the vital question of keeping people safe. And that is a common issue that we all share.
You did meet in April with all your counterparts from G7 countries. Where did you find consensus in those meetings? What actions should we expect summit leaders to perhaps commit to when it comes to some of the key security threats facing the world?
Well, there was a lot of consensus around that meeting table, again, because we all share the same concerns, the same issues in common. One set of concerns relates to the change in the nature of the terrorist threat in Syria and Iraq, with the defeat of Daesh on the battlefield at Raqqa last fall. The nature of that challenge is changing. Partly it means the terrorist groups that had traveled to that region now no longer have an active battlefield to fight on. So where are they going to go? We need to collaborate together to identify them, to track them, to make sure that we understand their movements and their motivations, where they are and where the risks will flow because these people are moving around. Secondly, they have shifted some of their activity from the battlefield to the internet, the virtual battlefield, if you will, and that vile propaganda that appears in such a dangerous way on the internet. We're working with the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism, involving the major companies, Google, Twitter, Microsoft, and others that are working actively with all of the G7 governments to be very effective at identifying the content that needs to come down, take it down very quickly, and replace it with counter narratives that counteract that kind of propaganda.
Okay, I know,
and we're making progress on that front.
I know you also talked about democracies and the interference in the election process of other countries. Should we expect to see a strong statement, perhaps some action against Russia for interfering in the election processes of other countries?
There was a very strong consensus around the table involving security ministers that these are really very real dangers and threats, and that we need to work together to counter them, using our cyber tools, for example, but also information sharing, intelligence gathering, making sure that we know when these events occur, when our respective democracies have been meddled with or interfered with, and making those proclamations public. So that people understand, and we keep track of the instances where foreign countries, foreign governments have interfered in the functioning of our democracies. We have those examples. We need to work together to combat them, and there was very strong will around that table to do that.
Okay, very quickly, a final question for you. What about Iran and Donald Trump's rejection of the nuclear deal? Do you expect G7 leaders, including Canada, to call them on that?
Well, the discussion will obviously be a very sincere one, and countries will express their points of view, and they'll express them in a very candid way. That is the great advantage of the G7 forum, that leaders get behind closed doors. They're sitting 2 feet from each other across the table, and the discussion is very candid, and it leads to some of the most important and influential conversations that you can have in the international setting. So I would expect the leaders to take advantage of the opportunity to make sure that they all understand each other very clearly.
All right, Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale, as always, good to speak with you, and thanks for your time.
Good to talk to you, Peter.
The G7 security ministers discussed a number of topics ahead of the G7, including their commitment to protect democratic institutions and processes, how to tackle disinformation and the media, freedom and human rights. Some of the conflicts they will be keeping an eye on in the year ahead include North Korea and the potential for a nuclear deal or a halt in nuclear testing, the tense situation in the Middle East, and in particular, conflicts in Iran, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Syria, Myanmar's Rohingya refugees, and the humanitarian crisis in Bangladesh, Africa's Sahel region, which is facing everything from jihadi violence to smugglers, Venezuela's economic and political crisis, and conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Ukraine.
So the G7 leaders will have lots to consider when they come together to discuss how to build a more peaceful and secure world. North Korea, Iran, terrorism, Russian aggression, Syria, cybersecurity, all of that on the agenda. Canada's stated objective for the summit is to set the international agenda on peace and security by establishing an inclusive and sustainable way forward for G7 partners. But here's the big question. Will any of that matter to Donald Trump? He's got his own agenda, and he's not worried about being offside with allies. So what should we expect to see when the leaders talk about peace and security? My next guest can certainly help us with that. From Washington today, we're joined by Laura Dawson, the director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Centre. And here in our studios in Ottawa, Colin Robertson is a former Canadian diplomat in Washington and now vice president and fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. And Wesley Wark is the director of the Security and Policy Institute for Professional Development at the University of Ottawa. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming to talk about this important subject. And Laura, if I can, let me start with you. G7 meetings, I think used to be pretty predictable affairs with communiques focused on consensus, often written even before the meetings actually take place. But not sure that's the case anymore with Donald Trump in the White House. Disruption, not consensus, seems to be the norm. What do you think we'll see when the leaders get around the table talking about security and world peace at this summit?
So we're going to see a situation where the leaders are really trying to manage Donald Trump. It's really not about getting consensus among the 7 leaders. It's really going to be about how to avoid any blow-ups, how to keep Donald Trump from going so far offline, setting the furniture on fire that they really lose track of the bigger agenda. And it's notable that this is Donald Trump's first official visit to Canada. We'll see how that goes. Fortunately, he doesn't have to pass through any major cities, any major airports, any major population bases, so there's not likely he's going to be encountering any Canadian protesters. But getting Donald Trump to Canada and back, getting everyone to mind their manners, managing that Trump relationship, that's going to be job one. The rest of the agenda is kind of incidental to that.
All right, Colin Robertson, what are your expectations for, any kind of consensus on some of these major issues that face the G7 allies?
Well, as Laura says, the G7 is a process, and so what you've had over the years, you've had the series of meetings, the Sherpas who guide this thing through. These are the personal representatives of the leaders, and then this whole series of meetings around issues including security. So in Toronto a month ago, we had the security and foreign ministers meeting, and they went over the big issues, the ones you enumerated, everything from Venezuela to North Korea to Iran, the Middle East. And that is, although notably Mike Pompeo, the new Secretary of State, was not there, but they tried to work things out. But you would have, of course, American representatives there. So they'll try and have something for the leaders when they get there. But as you point out, the unpredictable factor in this is Donald Trump. And so I guess from a Canadian perspective, just getting through these the 2 days will be critical. And does Donald Trump stay the 2 days? Because, of course, he has other things potentially on the agenda, a North Korea summit and the rest. And if they do get through the 2 days, what does the communique say? Because there is big divisions on issues like the Middle East, on issues like Iran. Can they come up with something? Because the communique is meant to be consensual, or do we simply have a chairman's report?
Right. Wesley, so many of these things are about expectations. What are yours?
I think that it'll be very interesting to see the leaders get together, and I think one of the big topics of conversation is going to be the issue around the summit on North Korea, U.S. North Korea and denuclearization. And I think that all the other G7 members, in addition to Donald Trump, will be interested in getting his view on the likelihood of that and what the American agenda might be, and also to the extent that they can, providing their own kind of input on what they'd like to see happen in that summit. And it'll be interesting to see to what extent Donald Trump is open to advice from foreign leaders on that issue, because he's surrounded at the moment by a very small coterie of people, I think, in Washington who may be giving him advice that runs in one direction only. So I think that'll be an interesting test for Donald Trump in an international summit, an interesting test for other leaders to see what they might be able to come up with a kind of consensus on approaching North Korea. I think there are a couple of other issues that where some common ground can be found. One is around cybersecurity, and there was a foreign minister's communique on that issue coming out of Toronto, and I think there'll be more discussion there. And it's an issue where I think there's a lot of common ground between all the G7 ministers and leaders. And then the final thing that may well be a subject for conversation is just, what next in terms of global terrorism after the military demise, at least, of the Islamic State.
Let me go back to the North Korea summit, if I can, Laura. And what do you think? Wesley suggests that one of the things to watch is how open Donald Trump is to input from other leaders about how to approach that summit. How open do you think he'll be?
The U.S. traditionally is not a multilateralist country historically, but then you take a guy like Donald Trump, who really is a go-your-own-way unilateralist, not just unilateralist with other countries, but unilateralist with his own government, with his own cabinet. He goes his own way. If he sees some sort of an advantage to bringing in a group of countries to his North Korea plans, then potentially, but all signs point against any sort of a multilateral or go-as-a-group approach. This is somebody who does something on the spur of the moment, on the fly, and usually in an individual, autonomous way.
Where can they, do you think they can achieve some sort of consensus, Colin? I mean, Wesley touched on some of the things we should watch for. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's right. I think cybersecurity, I think on the kind of new security issues, they can, because you can move into areas like pandemics and health. There's a number of other sort of issues which I think broad security, but one thing they won't, I don't see, will be trade, because trade is also important to the security of because that's what ensures our prosperity. I think it's going to be a challenge. I think you end up basically 6-1. The United States, or actually Donald Trump, is in one chair, and then the others, and that will be the real challenge for Justin Trudeau, because remember, prior to the meeting, he will have held a series of conversations with these leaders. We know he talks to Donald Trump on a regular basis. He will be doing his best to try and, because ultimately he as chair is the one who has to bring all this together. So he will be doing setup prior to. He's talked to most of the other leaders. Now Italy, of course, we're still not entirely sure who's actually going to be there, but that will be his challenge. And then when he's there, he'll have 2 days in order to craft some kind of, if he can, a consensus. That's the objective.
We talk cybersecurity, we talk interfering in the democratic process, and we talk Russia. And can I ask, is it clear where Donald Trump stands on the relationship with Russia? To be clear, I mean, it used to be the G8 and Russia was there, and Russia got kicked out. So, is Donald Trump prepared to take to sign on to a communique, if there is one, that strongly condemns Putin and the actions of Russia, given the sort of different kinds of in the relationship we seem to see with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? Wesley?
It's a good question. It's hard to know, and that's insider Washington politics is always very hard to figure out with the Trump administration. I think one could point to the possibility of Donald Trump agreeing to some kind of statement and discussion about Russia and Russian aggression and Russian intentions. And that's signaled by a couple of major strategy papers that the Trump administration has put out in the last several months: a national security strategy, a defense strategy, both of which had a certain kind of message about Russia from the Trump administration point of view. One, that it was a competitor, a rival, an aggressive actor. But the other message alongside that was that Russia was a power that the United States had to figure out ways to work with. So, that might be the sort of point of navigation on that with the other G7 partners. Just to come back briefly to the North Korean summit, I mean, it's not about multilateralism taking sudden effect in the mind of Donald Trump, but it strikes me as a perfect opportunity that comes about rarely at G7 meetings for the other leaders, many of whom more experienced in international relations, to do a couple of things. One is to actually stoke Donald Trump's ego. Fantastic that you're meeting, such an audacious, ambitious move.
But do you think he would like that?
He would love that. I think that's a safe bet, the safest bet we can make about the G7 summit.
Maybe
but alongside that,
a medal for this summit.
They're stoking the ego medal awarded to all other G7 leaders. But the other, substantive thing that can be done is that alongside that, it may well be that Donald Trump is open to some messaging about how, alongside that ego-stroking message, how you might best succeed in that summit. To have certain kinds of ambitions, but not be overly ambitious for a very first meeting. And I think it's hard to know whether Trump would be open to that discussion, which is a very sort of closed discussion, of course, of the G7 that is not meant to leak out at all. But he might well be open.
Laura, what do you think?
Well, I think an important dimension, though, is although it's about a meeting of leaders, it is not just about the leaders. So if we get a signal that is non-toxic or at least relatively benign on certain issues that the U.S. could be brought on board with, if Donald Trump is on board with things like cyber, things like new resources to development, to competitiveness, to dealing with terrorism, then a nod from the president then opens up all sorts of other resources within the United States, the State Department, USAID, Treasury, Commerce, National Security Council. These are folks that really want to be out doing good works in the world. So once you get a nod from the president, or at least not a veto, then the U.S. can go ahead and begin to apply some of its great resources in the world. And they can do so much more than many of the other small economies. So while the president is sort of a volatile character in this meeting, having a good presidential participation could open up a lot of positive U.S. resources into fulfilling the broader agenda.
Let's finish on this. Some observers have expressed concerns that we could end up with a de facto G6, that Trump gets isolated, and that's probably not a good thing. What do you think the likelihood of that is, Colin?
Well, that's the fear, that you wind up with that. And we've seen that before at NATO, and we've seen it at the last G7 to a degree. But so that's what certainly Justin Trudeau is trying to avoid. You want to try to have, first of all, Donald Trump stay for the 2 days, and secondly, to be able to come up with a consensual communique that reflects all the members, not a truncated version or just a chairman's report that the Prime Minister has to make because they can't get that consensus. So in a sense, the expectation levels are low, and what they're really trying to do is avoid a disaster.
Wesley?
I would put expectations as higher, a little higher than that, not to be overly optimistic about it. But I think, all of the other G7 leaders approach this summit with a clear view of the difficulty of dealing with Donald Trump, and they will have, despite the overall kind of agenda for the G7, they will have issues that they're pre-positioned to advance with Donald Trump, where they think there's going to be common ground. And so, I think at the end of the day, Canada has 5 sort of key themes for the G7. I'm not sure that all of those will be advanced with equal force, because they'll pick and choose the ones to keep Donald Trump on side. But I do think that the G7 meeting is happening at an unexpectedly potentially beneficial moment, given that the centrality of what I think will be the discussion on the North Korean summit.
All right, Laura, final word to you. What are your thoughts on the likelihood that we end up with a summit where Donald Trump's been isolated and things have been turned upside down?
Yeah, I think that's very unlikely. The last 20 minutes have given all of the other 6 an opportunity to learn how to manage Donald Trump. And you've got folks like Abe, Macron, and Justin Trudeau in particular, who've been very good at managing that relationship to make sure that he gets to look good and to make sure that he gets the things that he wants. And those of us that are in this sort of small country interdependent relationship with the United States, it's really not about turning your back on this country. It's about finding ways to manage and build productive conversations in the areas that we can, and especially given Canada's linkages right now with the United States on NAFTA, on so many other issues. You just can't afford to fold up your tent and walk away. You've got to figure out how to deal with the United States.
Right. Well, we hope they all stay for the whole summit in the Charlevoix region. There's hopefully no tent folding, nobody taking off. So I appreciate all of you giving us your perspective on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, they've been patient with Mr. Trump. That's about all you can do.
Being more assertive is maybe not the greatest approach to relationships.
I think we're an equal partner at the table, and we shouldn't let anyone push us around and treat us as inferior. So I'm all for playing hardball.
Well, the Prime Minister's foreign policy priorities will be on full display at the G7 summit. So too will his powers of persuasion when it comes to achieving these summit objectives on global trade, innovation, gender equality, peace and security. It is a tall order when a key player at the summit is at odds with Justin Trudeau and many of the other leaders on so many of the key issues. Gee, who would that be? But the current Prime Minister has been benefiting from the advice of a past Prime Minister who enjoyed tremendous influence on the world stage. So what should we watch for when Justin Trudeau is trying to get his fellow leaders to endorse his vision and to get along at the summit? Van Hampson is a Chancellor's Professor at Carleton University. He's a Distinguished Fellow and Director of Global Security Research at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. And he's the author of a new book on former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's foreign policy called Master of Persuasion, Brian Mulroney's Global Legacy. And Van Hampson is with me now in our studio. Good to see you again.
Good to be with you, Peter.
Thanks for being here. I want to get to the book in just a moment, because there are, I think, lessons and some parallels that we can take from what you've written about Brian Mulroney's time in office and on the world stage, and what we might watch for at the summit. But let's start with the G7 summit. How does Justin Trudeau manage outcomes and expectations at a summit which might be completely hijacked now by trade wars, steel tariffs, and a U.S. president that really doesn't seem to care a whole lot for the notion of multilateralism?
Well, this is clearly, it's a bit like a family reunion, an annual family reunion where the members of the family don't get along and really don't want to be in the same room together. The relationship, the transatlantic relationship is toxic right now, Peter. Our own bilateral relationship with the United States is being sorely tested by the steel and aluminum tariffs and the fact that NAFTA talks are stalled. And I think the Prime Minister's challenge is to keep his cool, to keep the rhetoric, certainly when these leaders are sitting at the table, down, and to make sure that they stick to the agenda, because as you just said, this agenda has been, in effect, derailed, but they're not going to resolve it sitting around the table going forward. At least I don't think so.
Yeah, is it resolvable? I mean, you look at the, and I guess if it's resolved to some extent, it may happen around some of these issues and where they might find common ground. Will they, I guess the question is, will they ever get to it? Will they ever get to the other things if they can't get past the animosity in the room?
Well, I think, quite frankly, the Prime Minister should use this as an opportunity to build an alliance with the Europeans on the steel and aluminum issue, because if we don't work with them, I think we're in a very exposed position. So this is an opportunity really for him to work with our European allies, to put pressure on Trump, to try to get him to see the light, and that is if he shows up. I mean, I think there's a potential risk that, you know, at the last minute he may decide to pull out.
Let me talk about the parallels here. Your new book on Brian Mulroney and his role on the world stage sets up some interesting parallels. I want to get to them in a second, but we're having this conversation in the context of this summit. So why did you write the book? Why did you want to tell this story?
Well, I want to tell the story because it really hasn't been told. I mean, under Brian Mulroney, Canada stood tall on the world stage. We had a Prime Minister who had the ear and counsel of not one, but two American presidents. He also enjoyed very close relations with key European leaders, Chancellor Helmut Kohl, Margaret Thatcher, François Mitterrand. And it was a period where we saw major initiatives. I mean, it wasn't just free trade, it was a new agreement on acid rain. It was the era when Canada joined La Francophonie. La Francophonie came into existence as a result of our joining it. Sanctions on South Africa to end apartheid. And then major initiatives on climate change, ozone depletion. I mean, the height of Canadian environmental diplomacy took place really under Mulroney. He was called the greenest Prime Minister and got an award from it. And it's the 30th anniversary of the 1988 summit that was hosted in Toronto, chaired by Prime Minister Mulroney. And that was the first time that climate change got on the agenda, and there was a lot of resistance and pushback from some of the other leaders.
He had that. He had an activist foreign policy, and do you see any parallels with where Justin Trudeau is trying to take foreign policy? And in that context, what can he borrow from Brian Mulroney?
Well, there are a couple of things he can borrow. I mean, I think one of the things that's really remarkable about the Mulroney era is that Canada played offense. We didn't play defense when it came to major global issues. We took the lead. It was sometimes risky, but we were bold. We were innovative. And so I think, unfortunately, as a result of NAFTA, today, you know, the Trudeau government has been, you know, forced into sort of playing a very defensive game. And I think, quite frankly, the G7 summit is an opportunity to kind of, you know, start going offense on the issues that matter for the Prime Minister.
How does he do that?
He works with those who want to work with him. That's true on climate change. It's true on oceans. It's true on cyber issues, where actually there does appear to be, you know, greater consensus. Western democracies, I think, are worried. But I think his challenge is to write a bold new narrative and to get other leaders to buy into it that the world's Western democracies are facing major challenges from Russia, from China, and we better hang together, otherwise we're going to hang separately.
And you mean the book about Brian Mulroney? Your book, does document some of the challenges Brian Mulroney faced, but did he ever face a Donald Trump? I mean, is that something much different that this Prime Minister is facing than Brian Mulroney had to face?
Well, there's no question that Prime Minister Trudeau is dealing with the great disruptor, as are all Western leaders. In fact, the entire world is dealing with the great disruptor. I think it's also fair to say that it's not just Trump. I mean, we're focused on Trump, but Trump represents populist pressures that have arisen not just in the United States, but also in Europe, in other parts of the world, from the losers of globalization. And so as the Prime Minister, makes the case for globalization, open markets, right, a free flow of investment, free flow of peoples for that matter, it's going to be important to address the question, how do you deal with the losers? And quite frankly, we got to work with the Americans. I mean, that was, I think, one of the things that was quite striking about the Mulroney period is that, President Reagan was not on the same page when it came to acid rain. I mean, that was a really tough file. And he was ideologically opposed to regulations to limit acid rain emissions. And I think that the lesson is you keep working at it, you keep your head down, you don't rise to the bait, right? I mean, there are a lot of people in this country who would be more than happy to see the Prime Minister take Trump on, to get up on a soapbox, and I think he's, that would be very detrimental to the national interests because this is an asymmetrical playing field, and quite frankly, power is stacked against us. So we got to work with the Americans, whether we like it or not.
All right, Fan Hampson, good to get your view on this, your perspective. Good to speak to you. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
Hello, I'm Peter Van Dusen, and this is a CPAC special presentation. The G7 Big Five. The G7 summit gets underway in just a few days in Quebec, and we are taking a closer look at the 5 main themes of the summit and what might be achieved. So let's focus now on the theme of preparing for jobs of the future. The leaders will be discussing a number of initiatives aimed at maximizing the benefits of rapidly changing technology and spreading those economic opportunities around for workers and industries everywhere. In a moment, I'll speak with experts about jobs of the future and how G7 countries and their workers, including here in Canada, must be ready to adapt to change. But first, here's CPAC's Martin Stringer to briefly set the stage for that conversation.
Potentially the biggest issue on the agenda when it comes to the jobs of the future is AI, artificial intelligence, computers capable of replacing human decision-making.
I am a year and a half old.
Perhaps the best known example of that is self-driving cars. But AI is also raising concerns and anxiety, especially about its possible impact displacing workers and eliminating jobs. Canada's approach?
And what we're choosing in Canada is to instead say, okay, let's focus on how we allay that anxiety, how we give confidence to people in the future, and that means moving forward boldly.
Canada is already a leader in AI with research and development centres, including the Vector Institute in Toronto and research clusters in Montreal and Edmonton. BlackBerry is working on self-driving automobiles, and other companies are busy in the field too, including Samsung, Microsoft, Facebook, and General Motors. The Trudeau government has announced tens of millions of dollars already in funding. But leaders at the summit will also look at other concerns raised by AI regarding privacy and with computers which can think for themselves, even applications which could be harmful to human beings. So the challenge for G7 leaders is how to prepare for a future driven by ever faster paced technological change that their citizens will embrace and not fear.
So get ready to hear a whole lot more about employment and jobs of the future and AI, artificial intelligence. It will be a very different world before too long, as the way we work and the kind of work we're doing, in fact, the way we live, goes through a massive transformation. But as always, we'll be presented with opportunities and challenges. My next guest can help us understand more about the kinds of issues that we and, oh yes, the G7 leaders will be dealing with on all of this. From Toronto today, we're joined by Sarah Doyle. She's the Director of Policy and Research at the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And here in the studio with me is Stephen Harrington, Senior Manager for Talent Strategies and Human Capital for Deloitte Canada. Welcome to you both. Thanks for being here to talk about this important subject. I guess this is one of those conversations where the average person can, I think, feel a little overwhelmed by the kind of change that we are about to witness in technology. So I'm glad that you're both here to give us a better sense of what the G7 leaders will be grappling with when they look at ways to prepare for the jobs of the future and what that means for people everywhere. So let's start big picture, Sarah, if I can, with you and talk about technology transforming the economy. What should we prepare for?
Well, I think we're seeing concern as AI technologies evolve and enable automation to replace a wider number of tasks that are currently filled by people. But I think it's important to acknowledge that we tend, I think, to over-focus on the risk to current jobs because it's much harder to imagine whole new jobs that may be created as a result of these technological shifts, or to think about how existing jobs might change. In history, we've seen technology change lead to net job increases. There's no reason necessarily to think that this time will be different, but we do know that the risks of these changes won't be evenly distributed across the population. People with lower levels of education, lower incomes, in some sectors, women or men may be more adversely impacted as these changes roll out. So supports are certainly needed in order to help them adjust.
All right, Steve, let me turn to you. What do you think we need to prepare for? What's coming our way?
Well, I want to underline something that Sarah said. The hardest thing to wrap your head around is that this time around in this industrial revolution, it's not about jobs, it's about tasks. So if the last industrial revolution was about defining what the job is, in this industrial revolution, technology is going after the tasks, not the jobs. So we're going through that uncomfortable period where people are figuring out what their job will look like when some of what they do today is done through automation. And we shouldn't be distracted just by technology. There's also a component of this which is about work preference. There's a lot of people in the Canadian market today who are in the so-called gig economy that are also going after tasks and would like to engage with work differently than we're used to.
Right, doing all kinds of different things, right? I mean, they're working at different things and changing many kinds of tasks and functions, right?
That's right.
Okay, so let's before we go too much further, Sarah, let's define the term. When we talk about artificial intelligence, what do we mean? Because I think for a lot of people, as I said earlier, that's a term we're going to hear a lot more of, but I'm not sure everybody gets exactly what it is. So explain it for us.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has the mystique of sci-fi attached to it. I think AI is really a body of new technologies or evolving technology. It's not one thing. And there's no exact line that distinguishes previous technologies from what we're calling AI today. But what we often mean when we talk about AI is the speeding up of the power of prediction. So being able to process huge amounts of data quickly and make predictions about what might happen in the future or draw conclusions from that data much faster than we might otherwise have been able to do using just our brains or previous technologies. So that's really, I think, what AI is about. But just to emphasize what that means in terms of complementary skills that humans possess, prediction may be much easier, but judgment is not something that AI possesses the ability to do. So human capacity for judgment, to evaluate what information to feed into an algorithm, to know what to use a particular AI technology for, how to apply it, those are all skills that will call upon people.
Stephen, let's go to the skills side. You've studied this, you know, and you've come to the conclusion that workers need to, what you call, future-proof themselves. What do you mean?
So within any job, and within our research, we looked at archetypes. So we tried to break this complex Canadian market down into bite-sized pieces. Individuals have a set of capabilities today, which they're deploying. And if you look closely at any archetype or any job, you can pick out those capabilities that are more likely to survive into the future. So for an example, your ability to influence. or your ability to curate a customer's experience. Very much to Sarah's point, there are elements like judgment that at least in the medium to likely long term are very unlikely to be automated.
Okay, let's turn, if I can, a bit to the G7 summit, and because this will be an issue for leaders there, Sarah. They'll be talking about challenges and benefits, and it's such when you get past the G7 to the G20 and so on, such a diverse set of countries, and how they might apply this technology and these advances for their own societies. What do you think the challenge is for G7?
I think the overarching challenge is to figure out how to invest in advancing the adoption of new technologies to ensure that firms and economies remain competitive. That's a real challenge that can't be ignored, while at the same time understanding and adjusting for the implications of those changes for workers, and as I said, for workers in different regions in different sectors, different ages, different income levels. I think we need to make sure that we're thinking about solutions in a tailored way that works for people. But I think there are some models that exist that are worth looking at, and I think that there's an exciting opportunity to trade some of these lessons across countries, since countries are grappling with a lot of the same challenges. I'll mention three things. One is the need to better link worker and firm success, and I think some models for doing that exist in Canada and in other countries. Those include consortium models for training that allow employers to pool the costs and risks of training amongst themselves, which incentivizes more employer involvement in training so it can be more aligned with employer talent needs, helps the firms and helps the workers. Two other quick areas. I think as we see technology become more pervasive across our economies, we need to invest more in digital skill development for everyone, and that means baseline digital skills all the way up to very advanced machine learning capabilities. And lastly, as we see these shifts happen faster, we need to be equipping people with the ability to adjust throughout their careers. It's no longer enough to have an education system that assumes that people will move from education into work and then they'll stay in one career. We need a system of lifelong education that allows people to move between work and learning throughout their working lives.
All right, so those are some of the things perhaps the leaders will be considering. Stephen, how do we do at that in this country on some of the things Sarah's talked about? How good are we at taking advantage of the opportunities and preparing a workforce to do that as well?
Well, we have sort of two broad worries that I think that policymakers are going to have to wrap their heads around. And one is, how quickly will Canadian organizations invest in the technology necessary to keep up with the Joneses around the world? Our track record as a country has not been fantastic, and we've often lagged the US as one big example.
Right.
The other issue is that we have a very real, right now, challenge in the employment market, where depending on your estimate and depending on your numbers, anywhere up to 33% of the Canadian market is already working in non-traditional work or contingent work, contract, freelance, gig economy. And both employers and governments have yet to figure out exactly how to fully utilize this growing non-traditional workforce.
How come? What's the challenge? What could be done better?
Well, let me give you an employer example. And these are real trade-offs that employers need to think through. If I'm going to deploy somebody and they're not really my employee anymore, I have to wrap my head around whether or not, let's say, a freelancer is going to give me the same commitment that an employee would give. Right. Or if I invest learning dollars or intellectual property, how do I protect those things with a new non-traditional workforce? These are real trade-offs that employers are struggling with. And I think government needs to think about how to help them through that process to create this new workforce that we're heading towards.
Follow up on that if you could for me, Sarah. How ready is Canada? How good are we as a nation at taking advantage of the opportunities being presented by artificial intelligence and technological change, and where are we lacking?
Well, I think, as was just mentioned, we're lagging with respect to technology adoption across a wide array of sectors, and that's a concern. I mean, that's not good for companies, and it's not good for workers either. That said, we've got some incredible strengths, and I think we've got governments that are looking to harness those strengths. There's renewed attention around these issues. AI has developed largely as a result of research that came out of Canada. Montreal and Toronto are hotspots for the advancement of artificial intelligence technologies. So we need to get better at harnessing that capability and integrating that into different parts of our economy. And at the same time, we need to be helping workers upskill so they can adjust and work within a changing context. And that, I think, is the real challenge that's facing us.
All right, let's finish on another one. And I think Sarah touched on it earlier. Stephen, let me start with you, and we'll come back around because I think it's worth a little more conversation. And that's the question of how do we get past the debate over how many jobs will be lost because of technological change versus how many jobs might be created or how many advantages there might be to it.
I think we need to get all stakeholders involved in the conversation. And that's when we did our research. We talked to union economists, we spoke to employee groups, as well as employers and government. And until we begin to have a conversation and make it clear that there are ways forward that could benefit all parties, I think we're going to remain stuck.
I mean, it's getting people past this knowledge. And when I have conversations with some people about this, is what does it matter? A robot will be doing my job. What's left for me? And the broader picture, I guess, robots don't pay taxes, so you need salaries and people making money, don't you, to support social programs? Or is that going to be a thing of the past?
No, I think that, in one way or another, the economists, the sort of Adam Smith economists who say there will be new jobs, will be right. The only question is and we like to look at multiple scenarios, how long will that take? And what do policymakers need to do to help us bridge between where we are now and that new workforce on the other side of the fourth industrial revolution?
What's the secret, Sarah, to getting people past the fear of all our jobs will be gone and will be replaced by robots?
Well, I think I think we should be thinking about this as an ongoing challenge. I don't think there's any cliff that we're coming up against where there will either be jobs or there won't. I think we're seeing a continuous shift in terms of the makeup of jobs, the tasks that comprise them, the skills that are in demand by employers. So I think I think it would be more productive to focus on helping people adjust to changing skill demand and to enable people to work within environments that are becoming increasingly infused with technologies of different kinds. I would agree that I don't see a jobless future being one of the scenarios that we're likely to contend with, but to me that doesn't remove the concern. We're still going to see disruption in our labor markets, and that's going to impact real people today and tomorrow, and those are the people that we need to be focused on.
All right, Sarah Doyle, Stephen Harrington, thank you both for your time on this. Good conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
I think we're playing quite a major role. It's good to see that we are being accepted as one of the major contributors.
I think who we have representing us on a larger scale is their knowledge base and what they do need to know about international affairs isn't the best people we could have in the position that they're at.
Yeah, I think that we make a good effort, but I think we end up playing more of a mediator role a lot of the times because we don't really we kind of lack the military power that a country like the United States would have.
I think we're still a peacekeeping country, thank God. And I think we've done an outstanding role around the world on all levels.
I think we come across as a very effective and proactive country.
I'm Peter Van Dusen. That's all for our special presentation, the G7 Big Five. An in-depth look at the 5 main themes for the G7 summit. The leaders from the 7 countries and the European Union will meet in Charlevoix, Quebec on June 8th and 9th. And we'll have full coverage of that summit right here on CPAC. Until then, thanks for watching.